Yes.
Professor Hay, I'm going to ask you about the issue of recombinant next. And I'm going to ask you to assist us with an overview of, a chronological overview of the attempt to obtain funding for recombinants and the various impediments and how it was ultimately resolved. So I think if we could pick it up in this way, what was the first point at which recombinants became available for use in clinical trials?
Well, I used it in clinical trials both in Liverpool and in Manchester. Those were phase 3 clinical trials, so there would have been phase 1 and phase 2 before then. And that would have been 1993 and 94 and 95. The advantage of phase 3 is they need larger numbers, and it was the only way the patients could get access to recombinant, and the general agreement was that they would be allowed to continue on a trial product until it got licensed, but then the difficulty was nobody would pay for it.
And we've certainly come across experiences in other centres with patients who were part of that trial and receiving recombinants, and then because of the absence of funding were expected to revert back to plasma-based concentrates. Is that what happened with your patients as well?
Yes. And that's an unusual situation because the company, I think probably reasonably, won't continue to provide it for nothing once it's a fully licensed product. But they will continue to supply it even though the trial has finished until it's fully licensed. So in some cases, the patients would have been treated with recombinant factor VIII for maybe 2 or 3 years, and then all of a sudden they're in a position where they have to go back to the old stuff for financial reasons.
And then 1996, it became the policy of UK HCDO to recommend recombinant for all. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I don't think we need to go to it, but that was the recommendation in the later iteration of the guidance that we looked at earlier this afternoon.
Yes, it was, although we announced the policy before we published the guidance.
But although that was the recommendation, funding was not available for recombinant.
Yes.
What steps were then taken, to your knowledge, to try and obtain funding for recombinant? We had negotiations with the companies to ask them to reduce their price, which didn't go very far. We spoke to the Department of Health, and a meeting was organised between the Haemophilia Society, myself, Professor Hill, and Lord Hunt, who was the junior minister with responsibility for our clinical area at the time, to make representations to him. The patients campaigned very actively, to the extent that I remember parents chaining themselves to the railings of the Children's Hospital at one point. You can imagine the parents were particularly keen, understandable. I think, the difficulty was the Department of Health wouldn't accept the viral safety argument. We were arguing that given everything that happened in the past with various viral agents, that by the time they were recognised, it was too late, that we wanted to give the patients the benefit of the doubt. There had been several episodes of odd infections here or there that had shown that the viral attenuation techniques, whilst very effective, were not completely effective. And we were worried that some new agent might come along. And I think the way you've put it in your statement is that UK HCDO argued there'd been an outbreak of hepatitis A, that there was evidence of parvovirus transmission, and there were concerns about prions, and that there may be other unknown pathogens resistant to heat treatment.
Yes.
the physical treatment required to inactivate prions would completely denature factor VIII. So it's theoretically more or less impossible to attenuate that.
Now, there came a point when the Department of Health agreed to fund recombinant for patients under 18. Is that correct?
That's correct, though interestingly, they still didn't concede the viral safety argument. They said that they were only doing this to allay the concerns of the parents. So that allowed them to climb down in a limited way while still not changing the argument. And so under the age of 18, by the time the next stage came along, those 18-year-olds were in their early 20s.
And that was, I think, 1998. And there was now recombinant factor IX available, so children with haemophilia A and haemophilia B were able to access recombinant from around 1998 onwards.
That's right.
There was an issue that arose, I don't know whether you can assist us with this, about non-availability of recombinant because of shortages of supply, due, I think, to circumstances in the manufacturing plant in the States. Can you recall when that was?
Yes, I can. I mean, firstly, it's worth remembering, because it speaks to the issue of the adequacy of supply, that when the children went on to recombinant in 1998, we were unable to do it fully for a period of 6 months, because it took that long for the manufacturers to wind up the supply to this country, because any supply that we were getting was in competition with other countries. And one of the problems that we've had negotiating lower prices until relatively recently has been that it's been a supplier's market. There has been a shortage of manufacturing capacity. That's no longer the case, but it was the case for quite a long while. Now, I think that the specific episode that you're referring to is the recombinant shortage starting, I think, about 2001 and lasting for 2 years, when Bayer had an inspection of their Berkeley plant in California, and their paperwork was not adequate. There was no suggestion that the product was unsafe. But whilst they sorted out their auditing processes, they were not allowed to issue any product. Because a product license is not just licensing the end product. You also license the process, which is then set in tablets of stone. And that process involves, amongst other things, auditing each step of the processing. And that's where they were a little lacking. So this was a huge problem, because at that time the only suppliers were Baxter and Bayer and Wyeth, who were marketing Refacto at that time. So the supply of recombinant factor VIII effectively halved to the whole world overnight. And this amongst other things, is a reflection of why so many of us have a policy of not putting all our eggs in one basket, because there were some centres that only used cogenate, which was that bioproduct. So their supply wasn't cut in half overnight. They had no supply at all. And the other manufacturers would naturally favour their existing customers. So I, as Vice Chairman of UKCDO, organised a system of supply swaps, which had to be agreed with both the clinician and the supplier, who would often have an existing contract, so that we could shift supply from one centre to another to at least enable the younger children to remain on recombinant, because otherwise you would have had the situation where you'd have whole centres where all of their kids would have had to go back to plasma-derived. It was a compromise, obviously. One would have preferred to have kept all of them on recombinant, but with that supply. And we also negotiated as fast as we could for the other suppliers to increase their supply.
Did it follow, however, that there were children, and probably in particular older children, for whom recombinant was no longer available and they had to revert to using plasma-based products?
They would have been predominantly older children.
Now, your statement explains that in 2003, the Department of Health finally decided to make available funding for patients to switch to, so now adult patients to switch to recombinant product. Is that right?
That's correct.
And what, if any, sense did you have in your capacity as Vice Chair of UK HCDO of the reason for the department's decision at that stage?
Well, we were all a bit puzzled. I don't know why it happened at that point, to be honest, because nothing much had changed. We were just very grateful, though with slightly mixed feelings, because as you know, and I guess we're going to talk about it, the funding for that was staged.
Yes, can you explain what the situation was then in terms of the staging and the judgments that had to be made?
I, off the top of my head, I can't remember the amounts, but in the final year, £44 million was required. The problem financially, to put it into context, was that recombinant factor VIII, being recombinant, attracted 20% VAT, whereas through some tax anomaly, plasma products are VAT exempt. And the unit price was twice as high. So recombinant products were very much more expensive than the plasma-derived ones. And so we needed a financial uplift to be able to change it. Now, unfortunately, they staged the payments over 3 years, and it was very much backloaded. So I think there was something like 15 million made available in the first year, 22 million in the second. The figures may be wrong, but the order of magnitude is about right. And we had to devise a system to prioritise the patients. And of course, naturally, that gave rise to trouble because we and the Department of Health, we would have preferred not to have been in that position. We would have much preferred to have switched all the patients at once. But the Birch Grove group, I think it was, objected to us prioritising younger patients. And they felt that those patients with HIV should start on recombinant first. We felt that the patients least likely to have been exposed to viruses should logically start first. That was the Department of Health view. And so we segregated it according to age.
And how long did it take then for recombinant to be available to all patients who wanted it? By what year was that process complete?
By 2006.
And you've said in your statement that towards the end of the recombinant rollout to adults, it became apparent that funding might not be secure. What can you recall about that?
What I think we were told was that the funding was separate. It was a separate uplift. We negotiated special contracts with all the suppliers that actually reduced the unit price and enabled us to roll things out slightly quicker. It was a very complex process, but towards the end, the Department of Health indicated to us that the money was going to be handed over to regional and district health authorities, but that it might be bundled with other items of spending. Now, the problem with bundling is that they might take 3 separate items of expenditure, each costing, say, 10 million, and tell people to buy all that with 25 million. It's often a mechanism for actually cutting the funding. And we were very worried that that would cause us to have to revert to plasma derived, which would have caused a storm of protest from everybody, not least the medical profession.
You were asked in your statement the question, should recombinant blood products have been made available to all earlier than they were, and if so, when? And I'm just going to read out your answer and see if you have anything to add. You said in your statement, yes, it was UK HCDO policy that we wish to treat all our patients with recombinant factor VIII from 1996 and for haemophilia B from 1998, when recombinant factor VIII and then recombinant factor IX became available. We wanted to give the patients the benefit of the doubt about safety based on the unknown virus hypothesis, having been at least thrice bitten by previously unknown viral pathogens, and knowing that some pathogens were difficult, protein-coated viruses such as parvovirus and HAV, or impossible, prions, the cause of VCJD and classical CJD, to inactivate. We wish to treat the patients with a product that should theoretically be free from all human pathogens. Is that right, and is there anything that you would add to that?
The only thing I would add to that was, whilst you were reading it out, it occurred to me that actually I think prions were the final nail in the coffin as far as the Department of Health's argument that we should not change over to recombinant because there could be no certainty about the clinical significance of variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease at that point in time.
You've also said in your statement that the department's position, which you've described, in other words, that they didn't accept that recombinant factor VIII or IX was safer than plasma-derived factor VIII or IX, has never changed, to your knowledge. Is that right?
Well, as far as I'm aware, that's the case.
Professor Hay, that leads us on to VCJD. There are quite a few documents I might need to ask you to look at. I'm going to start, sir, with a couple and then perhaps leave the rest till tomorrow morning.
Yes.
So in terms of the VCJD notification process, I just wanted to start in 1997 with, I hope this is the right reference, Shomek, HSOC 0015148. Yes, sure. I think I might have put in an extra digit. HSOC 0015148. So this is a letter dated the 26th of November 1997. It's co-authored by you. And it reads as a letter sent to patients. You say, I'm writing to you following the recent Panorama programme and in anticipation of further press reports to outline the current situation in relation to this condition, i.e. new variant CJD. I would also like to keep you informed of the measures which we've decided to take at the Manchester Haemophilia Centre and the reasons for these. You then talk in the next paragraph about what CJD is and the infective agent being thought to be a prion. You say in the last two sentences of that paragraph, there's no evidence that CJD can be transmitted by blood or blood products. Furthermore, there have been no reports of classical CJD in patients requiring regular blood transfusion or in patients with haemophilia. If we then go over the page, second paragraph, you then talk about new variant CJD. You explain it's different from classical CJD, appears to affect young people, and you describe how it's caused. And then in the next paragraph, you go on to say that there's a very small theoretical possibility that new variant CJD might be transmitted by blood transfusion, although experience would suggest that only a small number of susceptible individuals would be at risk. In light of this, the government has been advised to consider the possibility of filtering out all the white cells from whole blood and is currently commissioning an independent risk assessment, which will take 6 months to report. 3 weeks ago, BPL withdrew a batch of 8Y, factor VIII concentrate, because 2 of the donors had developed new variant CJD. Neither of the Manchester Haemophilia Centres have used these batches. And then you say this, last week the Executive Committee of the UK Haemophilia Centre Directors met with experts in CJD and plasma fractionation to consider the problem. Blood products like factor VIII are already made from plasma with white cells removed, do not transmit infections, I'll wait for the next page, associated with white cells like glandular fever or cytomegalovirus, and may not therefore transmit new variant CJD. And then you talk about the possibility of inactivation. And then the Haemophilia Centre Directors concluded that there was most likely to be little or no risk of infection with new variant CJD from blood products. Since there can be no absolute certainty about this for some time, it was felt that until the results of the DOH risk assessment were known, that blood products of UK origin should be temporarily phased out. In their place, products manufactured from plasma taken from areas free from BSE and new variant CJD, such as the USA, will be used. There are currently inadequate supplies of these American products in the UK, and so we plan to replace Replinate and Replinine with alternative products as stock run out. And then you offer patients the opportunity to call the centre, and then say you've arranged for a meeting in the main lecture theatre at the Manchester Royal Infirmary on the 11th of December to present the evidence and discuss the matter to which you are invited. So was this in 1997 the first main action taken by UK HCDO and then directors such as yourself in response to the developing knowledge about new variant CJD?
Yes.
Did the meeting that you've described in that last paragraph take place?
Yes.
And what can you tell us about that meeting?
To be honest, I can't remember that meeting, but it certainly took place. I think it was well attended, and we would have had a question and answer session. I would have made a presentation about what we did and did not know.
And can you recall what the reaction of patients was to news of a further potential threat to their well-being, and the news that there was going to be a reversion from UK-sourced blood products to US-sourced blood products, in some respects the reverse of what had previously happened? What did patients, how did patients respond to that?
Well, as you might imagine, their responses were very varied. We knew, because of the way that PRANs work, that only perhaps a third of the patients would be susceptible. Those are the ones who are homozygotes. Of course, we didn't know who was homozygous or heterozygous, but we did know that it was unlikely that it would be like hepatitis C or HIV and infect people indiscriminately. There were theoretical reasons for thinking that in this particular instance, the risk of transmission by clotting factor concentrates would be low. But having learned from past experience, I felt that it was important to emphasize what we did not know. Patients understand that. And in my experience, it's much better to say this is not known, it may take years to know, than to offer them some sort of speculation that they may take away as hard and fast fact, which might turn out to be untrue. I go into in my report, I go into the reasons why we felt that concentrates would be much less likely to transmit this agent than a whole unit of blood. And I would describe that to patients, but I would also say, we'll just have to keep an eye on everybody that has had these products, because there may be no certainty about any of this for maybe 10 or 20 years. And some of the patients got very distressed. Others were quite philosophical and probably went away with the relative reassurance that they'd been provided. At the end of the day, at this point, we didn't even have any evidence that variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease could be transmitted by blood, let alone the other products. This was in relation to discovering variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease in donors of blood, and the recognition that histologically one of the ways in which variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease differed from classical Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease was that you could demonstrate the prion protein in the lymph nodes and in lymphocytes, which are obviously elements of the blood system, whereas classical Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease is found in the central nervous system, and you don't find it elsewhere. So that raised at quite an early stage in our knowledge of the condition the theoretical possibility that it could be transmitted by certainly whole blood, less certainly plasma.
Now, this letter refers to the UKHCDO Directors Executive Committee having met with experts in CJD and plasma fractionation. At this stage, was there any particular involvement or direct involvement from the Department of Health in those deliberations?
I don't remember so, but they were certainly very much involved from an early stage thereafter.
I want to pick up a document trail from 2004 onwards with you, and I'll do that tomorrow morning, because there were then a range of notifications from 2004 onwards with which you were closely involved in your capacity as Vice Chair and then Chair of UKHCDO. But before we do that, can you recall, after 1997 and prior to 2004, what further processes there were involving patients and providing information to patients?
Well, the reason for doing this by letter and then following up with a meeting rather than to do it individually was because the press were finding out about it, and we needed to get to speak to the patients as quickly as we possibly could. As many of the subsequent conversations as possible were done on an individual basis, mostly in clinic, but sometimes in the centre. Many of these conversations were quite protracted because some of the concepts involved, for example, the concept of the public health risk, were very difficult for doctors to understand, let alone lay people, and I think caused a lot of confusion. So, yeah.
So I'm conscious of the time. There are quite a few documents I think it will be useful to look at with Professor Hay on the CJD notification process from the UKHCDO perspective. But it might be more sensible to pick those up in the morning.
Well, I think it's important evidence. It's late-ish in the day. I'm sure, Professor, you've had a longish day. Can we meet again at 10 o'clock in the morning?
Sure, certainly.
And the same rules apply as applied at every break during the day. But have a good evening and stay safe. And the same to everyone else. I look forward to meeting you, Miss Richards, tomorrow at 10. You heard what I had to say earlier this week about the attendance of others at the hearing centre following what I imagine will be the acceptance of Parliament of the government's proposals today about coronavirus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.